Many years ago, I read a book by Brad Stone, who is a reporter at Bloomberg News called The Everything Store. And it was about the history of Jeff Bezos and mostly intertwined with the history of Amazon, and specifically about how Amazon started from its relatively humble beginnings in Jeff Bezos' brain and in his garage, and how they, sort of cornered the market on books and grew into what at the time, I think circa sometime around maybe 2009 or so, was a pretty robust e-commerce store, particularly in the United States. All these years later, back in July of last year in 2021, Brad Stone is back, and he has a book called Amazon Unbound, and it is as informative and as enlightening as the Everything Store was. It's called Amazon Unbound: Jeff Bezos and the Invention of a Global Empire. And while the book is specifically tied to Jeff Bezos and Amazon, for probably about 80% of this book, are completely intertwined in there until towards the end, and you start getting into some of Bezos's work with the Washington Post and Blue Origin and space exploration, and his beefs with Elon Musk and so forth. And quite frankly, I just don't know how Brad Stone does it. I am so impressed with his ability to both write clearly with such a narrative that it's just, I don't understand how he gets some of the details that he gets from some of these people. You could almost open any page of this book, and I don't understand how they get to a point where it's like, well, this person sat here around the table and this person across the room was over here thinking about this. It's like, how do you know that? How do people remember that? Were you in the room? I don't think that he was, but it is remarkable to me that he has such so many quotes from so many different people, all with such remarkable detail. And it is so well written and easy to read. It's a long book. It's over about 400 pages, and took me most of the weekend to read, with several hours of effort in there. But it was a book that I actually couldn't put down. I was very keen to read it. I appreciate the book also has relatively modest chapter sizes. They're not overly long, so it's easy to sit down and then get to a point where it's like, okay, I'm going to read a chapter or read a section of a chapter here, and then pick it back up right where you left off. I give it 4 stars on this. Really, I give it probably about 4.25 stars on this. You'll like this book because it's incredibly informative. It's a little bit challenging too, but it's a pretty medium to fast-paced book. It's not slow at all. And there's several things that I've highlighted in here because I was so interested in some parts of Amazon and not others. Like a lot of people, I sort of have this love-hate relationship with them as a business story, as a success story. Amazon is certainly remarkable in what they have done, and it's hard not to recognize that this is sort of an only in America kind of story. It's also hard not to feel good about what Jeff Bezos built, to the extent that what it initially was and what it still kind of is a huge economic engine for a lot of people, for better or worse. Uh, for a while, it was hard to sort of get at what is Brad Stone's point in writing this book, with the exception that he'd already done so much of it with the Everything Store that a follow-up seemed pretty obvious. But almost at the very end of the book, in the epilogue of it, he asks the question, is the world a better place with Jeff Bezos and Amazon in it? And I don't know the answer to that question, even after reading this book. It is a complicated and complex question. So let's talk about some of the things that are in this book that I marked as notes. First up, there was a talk about a lot of the research that went into how Amazon produces all sorts of different things, from their Go style stores to Alexas and Echoes and the Fire Phone and all those sorts of things. But there's a section in here that talks about some of these buildings as part of their grocery efforts. And Brad Stone writes, the project was to be kept a secret from other Amazon employees, so the team set up shop above a sporting goods store in a nondescript 6th-floor building on Westlake Avenue. One of Pierini's first tasks was selecting a code name so boring that no one would pay any attention to them. For the next few years, the team would go by the initials IHM, short for the nonsensical Inventory Health Management. Much later, after years of laborious progress towards their ambitious goal, the project would be known by the name of the peculiar store they would create and try to bring to nearly every major city in North America, Amazon Go. In those early weeks of brainstorming, the IHM crew considered whether they should develop Macy's-style department stores, electronic stores, or Walmart-style supercenters. Bezos had no particular opinion about what they should sell, just that he wanted to disrupt traditional retail. One discarded idea involved 2 floor outlets with mobile robots swarming over an upper level packed with merchandise. Conveyor belts and other robots would then deliver them to customers waiting vehicles below. Amazon executives like to say and repeat compulsively that they start with the needs of the customer and work backwards. Ruminating on the act of shopping in regular stores, Pierini's team made lists of their advantages, such as the instant gratification of walking out with desired items. They also made a list of drawbacks. Chief among them was the frustration of waiting in checkout lines. People are busy. They have something they'd rather be doing, Pierini said. After months of research into customer needs and feasible technology, Amazon's crack team of Type A disruptors felt that the waiting problem was one that they could solve with technology. The PR FAQs from the time, with Bezos' handwriting scrawled in the margin according to people who saw drafts, coined a trademark for a system that didn't yet exist. Just walking out technology. Having envisioned the outcome, they would now try to invent a system that would allow shoppers to select items from shelves and get automatically charged without ever queuing up to pay. And they didn't know at the time that it would take 5 arduous years to sort of bring this whole project to fruition. And the details behind it are incredibly telling. It's again, one of those really well-sourced pieces of investigative journalism because he talks a lot about how the engineers were pushed extremely hard. There's definitely some overlap with Jeff Bezos' personality and that of Steve Jobs in terms of sort of being aggressive with employees and sort of pushing them to the brink of their abilities. And it talks a lot about how people in here, worked really hard to sort of make that initial first impression on Jeff Bezos and to not let him down on a lot of these things, but that they also thought a lot of things were completely ridiculous and completely impossible with existing technology, and that he pushed them anyway. And that how a lot of people say that Jeff Bezos brought out the best of them, for better or worse. And again, this is one of those complex things that makes you question. It's like, is that worth it? And it's almost like the military, right? It's like, yeah, I have to yell at you and make you do all this menial stuff to sort of tear you down so I can build you back up again. And you can sort of look at that academically and say to yourself, yeah, I can see how that has some value and I can see how that can change a person, presumably for the better. But that's an awfully big price to pay, right? It gives you sort of conflicting feelings about it. The book goes on in another chapter talking about how they were talking about expanding Prime Day and expanding their retail into other parts of the world. And it says Amazon in 2015 had moved into the zeitgeist in a way that perhaps even its own executives hadn't yet recognized. The event kicked off in Japan, where the local website promptly crashed due to overwhelming interest. This is talking about Prime Day. Then cascaded into Europe and finally into the US, where social media reaction was swift and brutally negative. Armchair shoppers ignored Amazon's proposed hashtag Happy Prime Day and took to Twitter to criticize the company for sold-out items, discounts on trivial products like dishwashing detergent, and an abundance of underwhelming deals. I keep going back to the Amazon hashtag Prime Day sale like a girlfriend who is convinced it's going to get better, said one typical Twitter post. The best deal I've seen so far is 15% off a box of Pop-Tarts, read another. In the context of this chapter, Brad Stone talks about how Jeff Bezos liked the idea of doing some sort of Prime Day, but also did not give it a lot of guidance about how to make it happen. And so they sort of scrambled at the last minute to just say, we're going to pull together this thing and we're going to give lots of discounts on lots of stuff. And obviously, wholesalers and manufacturers are going to have to be the ones that sort of foot the bill for some of that. And 2 of the team members had a hard time sort of making this happen. They write, Rupp and Wolf and their team had turned a Seattle conference room in Amazon's Arizona building into their designated war room. They spent 2 days and nights monitoring the traffic and promoting whatever deals they could. Wolf recalled going home to sleep for a few hours and then returning. In the middle of the chaos, Jeff Wilke stopped by and gave a pep talk. The event was ultimately the biggest shopping day in Amazon's history, but considering her struggles to bring Amazon's merchandise on board that first year, Wolf was not surprised by the negative reaction on social media. Behind the scenes, quote, Jeff lost his mind over the negative online reaction, said Craig Berman, a senior PR president, who was at his son's swim meet in Oregon when all hell broke loose. He was screaming at me and my team that we needed to be clear that these aren't crappy deals. He was being maniacal, saying, get this fixed. You've got to show this as a success. Berman and a PR colleague, Julie Law, started pouring through the sales numbers and releasing as much data as they could find on what products were being discounted and how quickly they were selling out. It didn't satisfy the social media mob, but press accounts of the first Prime Day were more balanced. To Jeff's credit, Berman said, you only get one chance to make a first impression. He was personally vested. A few days later, the Prime team gathered in their office kitchen in the Arizona building to acknowledge the end of their exhausting journey and took turns whacking a real piñata. But there was little time for celebration. Rupp and Wolf were asked to write a 6-page narrative summarizing the day's mixed results. 34.4 million items purchased, including 24,000 Instant Pot, 7-in-1 programmable pressure cookers, and 1.2 million new Prime accounts started worldwide. It also highlighted that a quote, subset of our members and the press were quite vocal, particularly in the U.S., claiming the deals were random, the experience was clunky, and that the event was a disappointment. Years later, Wolf reflected on that wistfully and considered it an illustration of the Amazon leadership principle that stipulates leaders must be vocally self-critical. That's when I learned a lesson that regardless of whether you just delivered the biggest revenue day in Amazon's history, your first sentence is, we effed up. It goes on to talk about how some of the team felt totally depleted and emotionally and physically after that initial Prime Day. And there was a note in here about Wolf, how she became a former disillusioned Amazon employee. She says, at some point along the way, it moved from an admirable mission to an uncomfortable awareness that for me, Jeff Bezos too often didn't make admirable choices, she said. He continues to amass an obscene amount of money and do very little with it for the good of society. She even questioned the annual spree of discounts that she helped create. When an article in Fast Company suggested that Prime Day cynically manipulated shoppers into buying things they didn't need, it resonated with her. It was a shopping holiday, Wolf said flatly. We were convincing people to buy Instapots and join a loyalty program geared at having them spend more at Amazon. Wolf left the company in 2019 and joined the Seattle online real estate company Zillow. She canceled her Prime membership shortly after, recycled her Amazon Echoes, and closed her Amazon account permanently. There is not a lot in this book about those sorts of situations where people became a little more disillusioned with the company, but there are some of those folks in here. And I don't know if it's because they were hard to come by and that Brad Stone had a hard time interviewing them, or if because they, were still loyal to the company in some way. Maybe they signed legal documents. I don't know. That was the sort of stuff that I was looking for in this book, not because I had some preconceived notion, but I knew that there had to have been something about that in here, because you just don't hear about Amazon and think about how much of a lovely place it is to work. Amazon, and the book makes very clear of this from multiple sources and multiple people, and even Jeff Bezos himself to so many extents, that people are there to work for the benefit of Amazon, and that other situations, personal problems or whatever, just don't factor into what it means to be an Amazonian, for better or worse. Moving on, there was a section in here about Amazon Prime and becoming a Prime streaming service with video. And it writes in here, by early 2017, Amazon had moved into its new 37-floor tinted glass office tower dubbed Day One, like its previous headquarters a half mile away. Bezos' old ideas about corporate anonymity were now impractical for a company of Amazon's prominence. The building was flanked by the first Amazon Go store and bore a giant yellow light sign with the computer science phrase "Hello World" on it, looking out over the park on its eastern side. That March, Amazon Studios executives traveled to Seattle to meet him there amid the busy, challenging construction of another skyscraper across the street and 3 interconnected Amazon spheres, company meeting places that, when finished, would double as nature conservatories. In one of the conference rooms, the frustrated CEO laid into the tepid storytelling of the man in the high castle. The execution is terrible, he complained. Why didn't you guys stop it? Why didn't you reshoot it? Bezos continued to reproach Price. You and I are not aligned, he said. There must be a way to test these concepts. You were telling me that we are making $100 million decisions and we don't have time to evaluate whether they are good decisions. There must be a way for us to see what will work and what won't, so we don't have to make all these decisions in a vacuum. After more debate, Bezos boiled it down, saying, quote, "Look, I know what it takes to make a great show. This should not be that hard. All these iconic shows have these basic things in common." And off the top of his head, displaying his characteristic ability to shift disciplines multiple times a day, then reduce complex issues down to their most essential essence, he started to reel off the ingredients of epic storytelling. And it goes on here to list things like humor, betrayal, a heroic protagonist, and so forth, compelling antagonist, wish fulfillment, negative and positive emotions, violence, and so forth. And I highlighted that book because it struck me again as a very sort of Steve Jobsian thing, that people who can take very complicated issues and distill them into something much simpler do have sort of an edge in this world, and that the world needs those people for some things. But that also sort of characterizes Jeff Bezos to me a little bit as somebody who looks at everyone else and can't understand why they can't understand. Anyway, the parts that I'm pulling from this book that I highlighted, I don't want to give the impression that they're all sort of negative things. There's an element of that as a characteristic to Jeff Bezos that is extremely valuable and good for the world. So I don't intend to sort of pluck out all the negative bits in here. The book is actually very well balanced and well written. It does an incredible service to sort of helping people understand sort of how the company operates, for better or worse, and how the people inside think and how they work, for better or worse. And it talks too about delivery, because you can't think about Amazon without recognizing what they've done to logistics and delivery. And talking about how their fulfillment centers came to be and how they started to build these things out. And Brad Stone writes in here, colleagues said that Clark had raw management skills and a temper that flared when employees didn't carefully follow his instructions. He earned a nickname, the Sniper, for his proclivity to lurk quietly on the sidelines and identify and fire slacking underlings. He could also be cavalier towards his employees. At all hands meetings, he would invariably brush aside questions by answering, "I'll get back to you on that," but rarely would. Finally, at one meeting, fed-up workers packed the first few rows wearing T-shirts that read, "I'll get back to you on that." Clark later insisted that he appreciated the feedback and even kept one of the shirts. Still, results from the Delaware Fulfillment Center were good, and Clark was impressing the only person who mattered at the time, Operations Chief Jeff Welke. He proved to me that with authentic leadership, he could get a large group of people, including a very tenured and opinionated workforce, to follow him, Welke said. Clark's purview over Amazon's East Coast operations gradually expanded over the next few years until he was promoted to Seattle in 2008 to take a job as director of a program called ACES, or the Amazon Customer Excellence System. It required him to advocate for the principle of lean manufacturing, a methodology popularized by Toyota in its factories that called for minimizing waste, maximizing productivity, and empowering employees. The role gave him a front row seat to a philosophical debate that would end up shaping life inside Amazon's rapidly growing fulfillment network. Clark's new boss and the primary evangelist for the lean method was Marc Onetto, a boisterous French executive from General Electric who took over for Jeff Wilke as head of operations when Bezos promoted Wilke to run all of domestic retail. Onetto was a lean fanatic. He introduced roles like water spider, a helper in the fulfillment centers who brought workers anything they needed, like extra packing tape. And he pushed the concept of poka-yoke, or designs that prevent human errors, such as a cafeteria trash can whose opening is too small for a meal tray to be carelessly discarded. One of Onetto's goals was to promote empathy and teamwork in Amazon's operations, which Seattle managers worried had grown heartless and punitive. At the time, the company was measuring worker productivity in every way possible and aggressively stack ranking or firing the lowest performing percentile of workers every year. Toyota's lean method, on the other hand, modeled a lifetime of work for the same company. But Jeff Bezos vehemently disagreed with that approach, and his and Onetto's marked differences in philosophy and style led to a series of significant clashes. In 2009, Onetto's human resources deputy, David Niekirk, wrote a paper titled Respect for People and presented it at an S-Team meeting. The S-Team, by the way, is Amazon's top-level senior leadership. The paper drew from Toyota's proven lean ideology and argued for treating people fairly, building mutual trust between managers and associates, and empowering leaders to inspire employees rather than act as disciplinarians. Bezos hated it. He not only railed against it in the meeting, but called Niekirk the following morning to continue the browbeating. Amazon should never imply that it didn't have respect for people embedded in the very fabric of how it operated, he said. Bezos also solemnly declared that one of the biggest threats to the company was a disgruntled and entrenched hourly workforce, like the unionized workers that impaired U.S. automakers with strikes and onerous contract negotiations. Amazon later denied that Bezos said this. He encouraged Nykirk and Onetto to focus on ensuring that fulfillment center workers who weren't advancing within Amazon stayed for a maximum of 3 years. Amazon then made several changes in its warehouses to ward off this danger. Where previously workers had been eligible for small raises in their hourly wage every 6 months for 5 years, now raises were cut off after 3 years unless an employee was promoted or a compromising operator who could gain operating leverage by slowing down the costs of its fulfillment centers relative to Amazon's skyrocketing sales. Fulfillment expenses had jumped by 58% in 2011 and 40% in 2012. Amazon hired 50,000 temporary workers in its domestic fulfillment centers over the 2012 holidays alone, and those numbers would keep going up and up to meet anticipated increase in sales. The new operations leader would have to run a hard-nosed run at the entire supply chain and figure out how to use technology to get more efficient. It goes on to talk about how they introduced various things like robots and logistics to help sort of speed the process along. The whole thing struck me as sort of the top-level approach to how people should be treated within Amazon fulfillment centers. And I don't think there's any surprise there. I think that those sorts of things are all things that we all inherently knew or understood to some extent about Amazon and about its fulfillment centers and about the kinds of employees that they have working in those sorts of things. I had just never seen it expressed in such stark terms before, that we would just recognize that we're going to have these folks around for about 3 years, and then we're just going to turn them over, and then we'll just have a whole new workforce. It goes on to talk about as Amazon gradually spread its arms around home delivery, Clark and his colleagues moved to take over another important stage of the supply chain. Until that point, the company had relied on big freight transporters to move merchandise from suppliers to Amazon's fulfillment centers and between the FCs and sortation centers. In December 2015, as Amazon was building new sort centers and Amazon Logistics slowly opened in new cities, Amazon announced that it had purchased thousands of truck trailers with the Amazon Prime logo on their sides, a program called Mosaic that was executed in part by Mike Roth. Once again, Amazon employees wouldn't do the actual driving. The company would rely on a mosaic of line haul service providers to attach their tractor trailers to the Prime emblazoned semi-trailers. This, they said, made Roth viewed as a masterful strategist, saying that he was playing the game Go while everyone else was playing checkers or chess. They also saw him as an empathetic leader who was more inclined to check in on an employee's well-being after a bad meeting or to discuss their long-range career plans. But there were limits to these compassions. When a Mosaic driver apparently showed up intoxicated to a supplier's facility, the resulting email of complaint went right to Bezos' public email address. Bezos forwarded it to an Amazon executive who asked not to be named, going beyond the customary question mark by adding 3 ominous letters, WTF. And it goes on to talk about how inside Amazon, they viewed their efforts to sort of well in advance to keep their risk of union and employee engagement relatively limited. It was pretty obvious they did not want anybody, forming long-term relationships with what we would generally consider pretty blue-collar workers there. The stack ranking thing, by the way, was also something that Microsoft did and realized a long time ago that it was toxic to their work environment, and that they've since said that they are much better off without it. Amazon has also said they have done away with it, but they've also done other things to sort of cap the number of managers and employees at their corporate headquarters, so that way they don't get bound by the same, or so that way they continue to sort of not be bound by bringing along laggards. Basically, that somebody has to be the worst at their job in any kind of workforce, and so if you can sort of figure out and root out who those people are, then you can remove them and bring in new people. The problem, though, is that Microsoft learned with stack ranking, if you have 3 employees and you rank them the best, an okay one, and underperforming, if you remove the underperforming employee, then the person who was performing well enough is now the underperforming person in comparison to the person who was at the top. And so you constantly have somebody at the bottom, and you're always culling about, a third or 20% of your workforce in a lot of these things. It also talks about how in the midst of the Amazon logistics build-out, the prospect of Bezos agitating for additional government succor was ironic. Amazon had already displaced significant costs onto the public. It didn't provide healthcare coverage for its drivers, who, by the way, this is me talking, were all independent contractors. It didn't provide healthcare coverage for its drivers, maintain the congested roads to and from its fulfillment centers and sort centers, or sustain the temporary employees who got jobs in its fulfillment centers over the holidays and then were unemployed and collected public benefits for the rest of the year. In building out a transportation network with considerable speed, Amazon had avoided many of the risks that often accompanied the unsexy business of moving items from one place to another. It also talks about how, in detail, these contractors were all exactly who you think they are. These are contract companies who exist to serve Amazon and primarily just Amazon. And so they cut corners all over the place in order to help keep costs down, because they are responsible. These contract companies are responsible for any overtime and other issues that might come about from not meeting Amazon standards. Basically, Amazon can come out and say, we'd like all these packages to get from here to here, and we'd like it to be done this fast, and we don't really care what has to happen in order to do it because we're not that involved with it, so you just figure it out. And then they turn around and turn a blind eye to things and hope that it all works out in the benefit for themselves and presumably for the customer in getting things faster. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't come at a significant public cost, including the number of contract drivers who are unlicensed or poor performers who were endangering people by running them over in the street, or as any bicyclist knows, all the people who sort of park in the middle of the street because they have to dart out. And there was plenty of reports of Amazon delivery drivers who, even though they look like Amazon drivers, they got a big Prime van or a big Prime truck with Prime shirts on. They are not Amazon employees at all. They are just contractors from some other place that you've never heard of that serve Amazon. It goes on to talk about how at one point Amazon was trying to expand its pursuits of revenue and market share, and it says, over the next few months, Amazon did something rare in its history. It retreated. Websites set up to sell tickets to concerts and other events were shuttered in the US and the UK. The company slowed down the introduction of a service called Amazon Restaurants into new cities where it was meant to compete with startups like Grubhub, DoorDash, and in the UK, Deliveroo, and 2 years closed it altogether. It also cut the investment in its beleaguered Chinese marketplace, which was hopelessly behind Alibaba and JD.com, and would also close for good in 2019. Amazon also froze hiring in the retail division almost entirely. For years, there had been few constraints on recruiting talented employees. Amazon headcount in Seattle had ballooned to 40,000 employees in 2017 from 5,000 in 2010. Over the next year, it was basically flat. We just decided that after years of rapid fixed cost investment, it made sense for us to slow it down for at least a year and digest the growth and make sure we were being efficient, said Jeff Wilke. And this is where it says that they tried out profitability. A foreign concept for years was tried on for the first time, like a new suit. Retail executives were ordered to revisit relationships with major brands like Coca-Cola and Unilever to extract more favorable terms on products like bottled water that were costly to ship. They returned again to their search engine to advance the company's commercial priorities, experimenting with factoring the profitability of items into the algorithmic equation that determined which products received an Amazon Choice badge. And that is why I highlighted that. That Amazon Choice thing is helpful. It came about because a customer had wondered why it is that they can't get the same sort of advice that they would get if they went into a small store or shop and asked the shop owner, can you give me a recommendation on the best, bicycle or the best fishing rod or whatever. The Amazon Choice was their method to do that. The problem, however, was that eventually they realized that it tripled or quadrupled the sales of those products over competitors. And they got to a point where they started factoring in, is this the best choice, or is this just the best choice for Amazon because it gives us the most profit? So think about that the next time you reach for that Amazon Choice product. There's also a part in here about, in a chapter called License to Operate, where they say, absorbed with the mechanics of its relentless growth, Amazon executives' employees were easy to vilify. Unlike its older peers, Microsoft and Boeing, the company donated almost nothing to local philanthropies like the county chapter of the United Way and didn't even match the charitable organizations of its workers. Amazon disputes this characterization and says that it has long supported Seattle initiatives. Bezos appeared to prefer to funnel every available nickel into new product lines or reducing prices for customers. Communication between Amazon and its hometown amounted to genteel emails between John Schottler, Amazon's longtime real estate chief, and city planning officials. Unlike other local luminaries such as Bill and Melinda Gates, Pearl Jam frontman Eddie Vedder, Jeff Bezos was largely invisible and a relative cipher in the community. I just highlighted this because they talk about how Amazon has what they sort of refer to a social license to operate, that you can exist in a city or community only so long as the people tolerate you being there, obviously. And that one way that companies sort of design their sort of social license to operate is they give back in big flashy ways. This, by the way, is the same tactic that electric companies and the water company and stuff do, because they know that whenever they need to do rate increases or to do something that you won't like, they need you to have felt goodwill towards them all along. Jeff Bezos seems to have funneled most every available nickel back into Amazon to do things like develop new products, R&D, or lower prices. And this, again, is one of those conflicting things. It's like, is that a bad thing? Is it a bad thing to develop new technology? Is it a bad thing to lower the price of some services and goods for the betterment of people across the country in lieu of, say, donating $50,000 to the United Way? I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. It also talks about HQ2, the new headquarter process that they all went through recently. There was a bit in here because there was details that I had never seen before about some of the cities. As part of the bid process, they write, for Bezos, the HQ2 search was not only the subject of pressing interest for the future of the company, but a PR spectacle that was now casting a large shadow over most of its public appearances. That April, he traveled to Dallas to speak at the George W. Bush Presidential Center Forum on Leadership at Southern Methodist University. At the cocktail party afterward, Dallas Mayor Mike Rawlings walked up to him and went for it, saying, "Look, we're the right place for you." Bezos was coy and said only that he had heard great things about the city from friends who lived there. "I felt a shyness from him that didn't make me feel great," Rawlings later told me. For context here in the background, HQ2 was absolutely a publicity stunt. It makes it pretty clear about that in the book. They were also talking about how HQ2 was them not wanting to be so reliant upon Seattle. And so the team, as Bradstone writes, the team completed their visits that month and prepared a 6-page paper for the S-team with their results and recommendations. I viewed that paper along with 2 other key HQ2 documents during the course of my research. Prepared in June 2018, the first paper broke the 20 finalists into 3 groups: not viable, hotly debated, and top tier. Austin, Columbus, Denver, Indianapolis, Miami, Montgomery County, and Maryland, Newark, and Pittsburgh were all cast in the first category and dismissed, largely because they were too small and did not have the required infrastructure and talent. In addition, the team had concluded from their visits and from analyzing public sentiment that Austin and Denver might be hostile to Amazon's presence. It was clear from our visits that Austin and Denver were not as supportive of the project as other sites, they wrote. Pittsburgh was still recovering from economic hardships, and Newark was flatly rejected because talented engineers from New York City, quote, would not want to work there. Atlanta, Boston, LA, Nashville, Toronto, and Washington, D.C. were listed in the hotly debated category. The HQ2 group cited high costs and high taxes as negative for Boston and Toronto. They described the traffic congestion of Atlanta as problematic, as well as the recent move by the Georgia legislature to kill a tax exemption for Delta Airlines jet fuel purchases because of the airline's controversial decision to end discounts for NRA members after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. To Amazon, the state's move to penalize a company for its political values was troubling. They also stated that we had high expectations for Nashville, but the city isn't ready for an investment of our size. And of LA, it opined, in the world's most congested city, it does not provide geographic diversity, and California is not a business-friendly state. Top-tier locations were Chicago, Dallas, New York, Northern Virginia, Philadelphia, and Raleigh. And despite recommending these cities the most, the HQ2 team still expressed concerns about them. They worried that choosing geographically isolated Dallas would make it more challenging to recruit top-notch talent. New York City was the costliest location in terms of local taxes, compensation, and real estate, and with many other major employers, quote, we would not be able to leverage our presence in a positive way as we could in other locations. Northern Virginia was business-friendly, but not a hotbed of engineering talent or particularly inexpensive. In closing, it says they recommended several sites, and then it turned out that what they mostly ended up with was a situation where, with New York initially, before they pulled that, it was just places that the executive team realized that they just wanted to be. And so that tells you everything that you need to know about how locations for things are chosen in this country, is that 99% of the time, it's just where do these people want to be? And it's usually in places that you're not. It's usually superstar cities like New York, DC, and LA or San Francisco. Anyway, I found this whole book incredibly enlightening. There's a section in the back about the antitrust work that Amazon has worked on and has been facing, their sort of big data assets and things like their interactions with the Trump team and other political issues that they've now gotten mired in. And I think that the conclusion of this book summarizes this the best. Still Lending, of course, was a definitive answer to a perennial question that even now is almost impossible to resolve. Is the world better off with Amazon in it? Or perhaps, in the wake of Amazon's evolution into a trillion-dollar empire and Jeff Bezos' graduation into the annals of business history, it simply no longer makes sense to ask. The company is now woven inextricably into our lives and communities, hooking customers on the convenience of ordering from home and posing insurmountable challenges for all but the nimblest local retailers. It calls to mind Bezos' old saying about one-way and two-way doors and type 1 irreversible decisions. Long ago, we stepped through a one-way door and into the technological society conceived of and built in large part by Jeff Bezos and his colleagues. Whatever you think about the company and the man that controls so much of our economic reality in the third decade of the 21st century, there is no turning back now. And that is very, very true. I think it's a good book. You should read it. It's 4 stars from my rating. Very informative. You'll like this book if you care at all about sort of capitalism, the growth of companies like Amazon, business history, the history of entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos. It's an excellent book, well written. Brad Stone did an amazing job on the research and is well worth the read.